Welcome. The theme of this lecture is groups, teams and their leadership. This is your lecture for Teaching Week 2 of your Professional Practice module. This lecture is designed to help you work towards Learning Outcome 3, which states that you will be able to work effectively as part of a team, and you can also use it to help work towards Learning Outcome 5, which is thinking ahead to planning your professional development. The agenda for this session is as follows. First, we will look at the concept of groups and teams. Then we will look at Tuckman's model of group development. We will then use Belbin's work on teams to look at the significance of team roles. We will look at the role of management in teams, followed by the key characteristics or skills of high-performing teams. We will then look at some research on what makes effective student teams, and finally we will look at what the implications are for virtual teams. So let's start by looking at the concept of groups and teams and how their very nature is changing. Often people use the term team and group interchangeably, a point picked up by Mullins in his book Organisational Behaviour. His book is available through the BPP online library if you want to read more about this. There isn't really a universally agreed definition of teams, and certainly in practice teams can be used to describe a variety of different groups of people. For example, you may refer to your team as a department that you work in, i.e. the finance team, yet the reality is that each person's job in that team is largely independent of each other, and they just happen to report into the same person and work in the same department. This is often more akin to formal definitions of a group rather than a team. We then refer to project teams, which may be short-term groups of people that have come together for a specific task with a beginning and an end. At the end of the task, they disperse and go back to their original teams or departments. We find in many organisations these days that we can move in and out of different teams with different objectives throughout our working lives. We may have in the past only imagined teams as working in the same place at the same time. However, now we have virtual teams, which are those people that may be working on the same project or in the same department, but may sit in different parts of the country or even in different countries to each other. Therefore, the nature of these types of teams are changing. The question is whether it is important or not to distinguish between what makes a team and what makes a group, and whether they are significantly different. Belbin tries to differentiate between the two, arguing that teams are smaller and member selection is more crucial, whereas groups are larger and less specific with regards to who joins them. Belbin has used this theory to create and develop the model of team roles that we will look at later in this session. Martin argues that teams are groups with a particular context, and Katzenbach and Smith argue that the difference is about the performance outcome achieved. By this, they argue that high performance comes from teams rather than from groups. For example, on the lowest end of the spectrum is the working group, which they describe as a collection of individuals working collectively to a limited degree. Performance here largely reflects the efforts of the individual members of the group rather than a collaborative or combined effort. At the far end of the spectrum are high-performance teams. They describe this category as a real team that is committed to the common purpose and appropriate ways of working, as well as personal growth of its members. It's therefore possible to argue that group development leads to high-performing teams. This echoes Tuckman's model of group or team development, and we will look more at what makes an effective team later on. However, it's fair to say that in your working lives you'll be in a variety of different teams, and to learn how to be a team player is essential to your professional development. Let's take a look at Tuckman's model of group dynamics. Tuckman identifies 5 key stages of group or team development: forming, storming, norming, performing and adjourning. We are now going to go through each of these key stages of group dynamics in turn to understand how we can contribute to effective teams. As we do, try to think about your current position and the group or team that you are part of, and see if you can recognise any of these stages in your group or team. You may be in several different groups or teams, such as sports teams, church groups, work teams, study groups, etc. So try to compare your experiences in each team and whether you are at different stages of group development, and think about why that might be. Forming is the first stage of group development. This is where the members of the group are more likely to be wary of each other. a little bit apprehensive and potentially quite suspicious of each other's motives and agendas. At this stage there is a lot of uncertainty and confusion. Think of yourselves in this study cohort and your induction or the first time you all met. You are at this stage a group rather than a team, and you don't yet know how you fit in or where you belong or how things are going to work. You have lots of unanswered questions, and it can be very unsettling and very distracting. You can quite possibly feel like a fish out of water, or at the very least like you don't fit or belong. This is likely to have an impact on your study. For example, you might not be focused enough, you might not be clear on what you need to do and who you need to work with, and how or why. At this stage, you are not performing to your full potential, nor are the other members of the group. This then leads on to storming, where you try to create a sense of purpose of where you fit and where you belong. At this stage, members of the group now start to vie for attention. Leadership challenges appear as people start to make a claim for certain roles or positions in the group. Whilst in a work environment, you could argue that your positions are already determined by your job title. The reality can actually be quite different. You may understand the formal hierarchy that exists in an organisation, but there is always the unwritten agenda of social dominance and leadership that can come from within rather than from formal structures. It is often at this stage of group development that conflict can begin. I will give you an example. Early on in my teaching career, I was running a session with some workplace trainers from some well-known national organisations. I was the lead trainer in a room full of trainers. This was an uncomfortable situation for all of them, as they were used to being the lead person or authority in their training rooms back in their workplace, and they were on this occasion finding themselves in a position of less authority than they were used to with a group of people they didn't know. At the beginning of this 5-day course, I remember a particular member of the group often interrupting me to suggest now would be a good time for a break, or perhaps an activity might work better in a different way. They spent much of their time disrupting other groups or trying to dominate the conversation without listening to or giving others a chance to speak. They were clearly vying for the position of leader in this group. What this demonstrates is that the official roles we are assigned to or labelled with do not necessarily correlate with where people feel they are or want to be in the team, and this can affect their behaviour and their ability to work with the team in a supportive manner. At this stage, this type of behaviour is disruptive and unsettles the team. You are therefore not performing at your optimum output at this stage. It is at this stage that the management of teams or groups is absolutely essential. If the group is to get beyond the storming stage, then they need the support to get there. Strong leadership that is able to identify each team's strengths and weaknesses will help them to reach the right position and the role for them. It's essential to enabling the team to progress beyond the storming stage. This therefore requires a skilled manager who is able to understand the nature of the individuals within their teams. It also requires strong leadership to help inspire and motivate the team towards a common purpose or goal. It's also important to note that effective team leadership isn't about who has the best ideas or who shouts the loudest or who has the most experience. Effective team leadership is about helping the team to identify their strengths and where they can have the most impact and contribution. It's also about empowering members of the team to take responsibility and encouraging participation and joint decision making. As we will see later in this session, effective teams are not usually those that are led by an authoritarian leadership style. You may find it useful to refer to some of the literature around management and leadership. John Adair's leadership model that looks at concern for the task, the team and the individuals would be a good place to start. John Adair's book Leadership and Motivation can be found in the BPP online library. So now we can start to see a significant difference between teams and groups. According to Belbin, team membership is based on specific selection of attributes and behaviours, whereas group membership is less determined. Therefore, teams should be able to get through the norming stage much faster than groups. Finding your place in a team and identifying your role and your contribution, as we have seen, is essential to move teams beyond the storming stage. Belbin identifies that effective teams have a balance of 9 key roles and are shown on this slide as follows. The 9 roles are listed on this slide as plant, monitor evaluator, coordinator, resource investigator, implementer, completer finisher, team worker, shaper and specialist. Each of these roles has both strengths and weaknesses, but Belbin argues that all of these roles are important for an effective team. However, Belbin is often misquoted, and it can be assumed by some that the optimum team consists of 9 people, each with a different one of these skills. However, one person can arguably have more than one of these roles. The skill of the manager is to identify who has the skills and therefore what their role should be, and then to allocate the tasks and the actions appropriately to utilise them in their position for maximum team performance. As we look at each of these roles in turn, try to think about your own strengths and weaknesses. Where do you feel you might fit within each of these roles? Whilst just thinking about which role sounds like you isn't particularly scientific, there is actually a Belbin's questionnaire that, if administered by a properly trained assessor, can help to more specifically identify each member of the team's particular strengths and the roles which would be most appropriate for them. Many work teams do use these types of tools to help understand where their strengths best lie in order to work more effectively as a team. Establishing team roles will help the groups move on to the norming stage, where they become settled, sharing information, operating under agreed processes and systems, and operating in a much more coordinated manner. It is at this stage that performance norms and group cohesion is formed. Group cohesion, according to Martin, is defined as the strength of mutual bonds and attitudes among members. It's what makes you want to stay rather than leave. It's about your sense of belonging and how much you feel part of the group. Weaker cohesion exists when members of the group perhaps feel they are only there on a temporary basis, that they don't really agree with the norms or values of the group and intend to be gone at the earliest opportunity. This ultimately impacts commitment and willingness to go that extra mile, or to display discretionary behaviours such as the willingness to work late or weekends if needed. Think about your own groups or teams. Was there a strong or weak cohesion? Was there much commitment or not? And what do you think are the reasons for this? Group norms, according to Mullins, are defined as the pattern of informal social relation codes and practices that constitute proper group behaviour. However, group norms aren't always positive, and this is where good management and leadership are needed to steer the group towards a positive set of norms. Negative norms might include things such as only working your contracted hours, not working too much within those hours, and only doing what you are told rather than using your initiative or being proactive. Norms are often learnt patterns of behaviours that evolve over the years in response to various stimulus within the workplace. Positive group norms, however, will lead to higher performing teams. Eventually, with all being well, the team will reach the stage of performing. This is where the team is now functioning fully and has complete commitment and shared purpose. Mutual responsibility towards the end goal will exist. Effective management at this stage, according to Mullins, will ensure that the manager is aware of and pays attention to a number of factors, including clarification of objectives and available resources, organisational processes and the clarification of roles, empowerment, decision-making and channels of communication, patterns of interaction and attention to both task and maintenance functions, social processes and the informal organisation, management systems and the style of leadership, and training and development. However, it's not all down to the managers. The individual personalities, behaviours and attitudes of the team members, and that includes you, have a significant influence on whether a team is to be high-performing or not. Cloak and Goldsmith identify key skills required of team members, and they are as follows: the skill of self-management, skill of communication, leadership, responsibility, supportive diversity, and feedback and evaluation. So what do these skills actually involve? Well, to find out more about self-management, listen to this short video of Lord Chris Holmes, the Paralympic swimmer, talking about a couple of self-management techniques.
Prioritisation is probably the most important skill to have, both in terms of your professional life and your personal and social life. When it feels like everything's coming at you at 1,000 miles an hour, when you've just had 100 emails into your inbox in one go, when it feels like you haven't got a second, you've just got to get straight into the first piece of work, that's when it's absolutely vital to prioritise, to take the time to scan through quickly but effectively all the work which is there, and to put a prioritisation on that. And the time you save by doing that, absolutely invaluable. To achieve balance is always a constant battle, I think, and none of us ever get it perfect, but it's trying to get as close to that point of perfect balance as you can. And it really is about having a clear understanding of what you're trying to achieve. What are all the goals that you've set out in work, in studying, social life, seeing your mates, everything. You've got to understand all the things you're trying to achieve, and then absolutely put them into a clear time framework. And sometimes, maybe oftentimes, there won't be enough space to fit everything in, but it is about then making those critical decisions. What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? And crucially understanding that it isn't any good to not be constantly trying to have that balance at the heart of it. Doesn't mean that every week, every day will be balanced. There'll be extremities within that, but over a period of time, there has to be that balance.
So as you can see, self-management is about taking ownership and control of your own life and ensuring that you meet your commitments and deadlines. It's about ownership, responsibility and commitment. The question to ask yourself is whether you take responsibility for your own actions and your own work, or do you always look for a reason or for someone else to blame as to why you couldn't get something done. Communication skills involve not just how you formulate your message to ensure that it's clear and able to be understood, it's about understanding your audience. It's about communicating honestly about things that really matter and not getting sidetracked or off on a tangent. Poor performing teams spend too much time talking about things that aren't important. Good communication is also about your listening skills. You might be surprised to hear that listening is a skill, but it's something that poor performing team members aren't so good at. Think about yourself now. How well have you been listening to this recorded lecture? So what does effective listening involve? As already mentioned, it's a mistake to assume that listening doesn't take any effort. It takes a great deal of concentration. And if you're not concentrating because you're thinking about something else, or you're distracted by something on your phone, your iPad, something out the window, then you'll miss what is being said. You'll hear, but you won't be listening to it. So poor listeners actually tune out. The trouble is, if you're too busy worrying about what you want to say or what you think you should be saying, you might be rehearsing what you want to say in your head to make sure you say it right. But by the time you get your turn to speak in the team, either the conversation has moved on and your point is no longer relevant, or you find yourself repeating what's just been said, or it makes no sense at all in the context. Sometimes you may have a bad habit of saying, yeah, which means you're not really listening, or even saying, yeah, I've heard this all before. So you tune out and you don't really listen. The chances are you might have heard this before, but you're best to check in case there is something new being said. Plus, if you have heard it before, it might just imply that it's important and should be paid attention to. Sometimes we can get distracted by the sound of a person's voice or their delivery manner. This can take some effort to filter out and ignore the elements of tone and pitch that might potentially distract you. For example, someone with a particularly high-pitched voice or someone who speaks in a monotonous voice may lead you to focus on their voice rather than what they are actually saying. You need to learn to filter these distractions out and just listen to the message. So poor listeners let their emotions get in the way. You need to learn to recognise your emotional reactions. Take, for example, a situation where you've submitted a draft report for review. You've worked hard on it, you've spent the whole weekend on it, and missed out on some social events just to get it done. Yet when the team look at it, they have lots of comments of things they would change and should be done differently. It's easy to react defensively and feel either offended or insulted by their comments. This can stop you from listening and understanding that the comments are actually there to help. You need to listen objectively and detach yourself from emotions in these circumstances. Now, we all multitask. How often have you sat on the sofa watching TV whilst texting on your phone and looking something up on the iPad? Doing two things at once is not easy, but most of us do it. However, the reality is, if we want to be effective listeners, we have to focus on listening and not all the other activities or distractions around us. Physically, people have the ability to listen at a rate of 500 to 1,000 words per minute. However, the comfortable average rate of speech is only 150 words per minute. This difference between your ability to comprehend and the rate of speech creates a problem for the listener. Sometimes poor listeners concentrate specifically on facts rather than ideas, themes, or the general meaning of what is said. This is actually an important thing to consider when you're in class and listening to your tutor. Facts are important, but ideas are usually more significant. If you grasp a fact but concentrate so hard on getting it, you may lose the main idea behind it. Usually, if you grasp the overall meaning, you'll remember most of the important details, but a fact that's isolated from its context can easily be forgotten or distorted. And finally, a key listening skill is to test for understanding. Sometimes we may not interpret what is being said as it was meant. So try using phrases such as, "So just to clarify, the key issue is," or you could say, "So to summarise, what we need to do is." This type of clarification of understanding prevents the individuals in the team leaving with a different comprehension of what has been said and agreed. So let's get back to our list of effective team skills. The next one on the list was leadership. Some key leadership skills such as coordinating, collaborating, facilitating and coaching are all important attributes for each team member. And if your position in the team is one of expertise in a particular field, then you need to be able to lead around your area of expertise. However, leadership skills are also about empowering others to take leadership when it's appropriate, and it's not about dominating or forcing the team into your own agenda. The next skill is the skill of responsibility. In self-management, we looked at taking responsibility for yourself. Within the wider concept of responsibility, all team members have a responsibility not just for their own work, but for the work of others too. It's no good just getting on and making sure you're okay if other members of the group need some support. Think of this as an example. You have a group presentation to write, and there are 3 of you in a group. You each go off and write your bit on your own and write your own slides. When you meet up 10 minutes before the presentation is due, you put your slides together in one PowerPoint. During the presentation, you discover that you have each covered some of the same material. What the first person says has no link to what the second person says, and that the third person hadn't found any literature or research to base their statements on. So by not checking in on each other and not taking responsibility for each other, the presentation turns out to be quite a disaster. The 5th skill is that of supportive diversity, and this means that you work in a collaborative way to overcome prejudice and bias. Teams that have supportive diversity do not mistrust people who are different. Diversity can come from a variety of areas, such as some of you went to private school, some of you went to state schools, some of you may be from different countries, different religions. You may like different types of music and dress in a way that fits with that culture. So a good team recognises that differences aren't negative, and that there is a value to embracing diversity as it brings with it different perspectives and things you may not have previously thought about. And finally, we need to embrace the skill of feedback and evaluation. This is essential to improving learning, team communication and the quality of products, processes and relationships. We need to be able to both receive and give feedback appropriately, as well as to use evaluation data to measure the effectiveness and impact of the team. The final stage of group development, therefore, is adjourning, and this is where the team has completed its task and may now be disbanded. When looking at what makes successful student teams, the principles are largely the same as we have already considered. Locker and Kazmarek conducted research into successful student groups and found that the most successful student groups were not always the ones with the most individually skilled students in them, but were those that communicated most successfully. Take, for example, a sporting analogy. You've been asked to pick from each Premiership football team the best player and put them in a new team altogether. You would think that this new team would be the best team in the world. Yet they play much better when they are in their club teams than when they are in the new super team. So why is this? Well, it's quite simple. The new team hasn't gone through the stages of group formation, and everyone is focused on themselves as being the star player. They haven't learnt how to play or work together. So a group of highly talented individuals, when put together, won't automatically make a high-performing or successful team. It's worth thinking about this when you're working in your student groups to complete assignments and projects. So characteristics of successful student groups, as identified by Locker and Kaczmarek, are those that assign specific tasks, set clear deadlines, and schedule frequent meetings. But it is important to note that you have to turn up for those meetings. They listen carefully to each other. They're not trying to talk at or over each other. These groups will deal directly with conflict. They won't let it bubble away under the surface. They see that it needs dealing with and they will do it. They develop inclusive decision-making style. There isn't an authoritarian leadership within that group. And they do establish proportionate workloads. So think about these characteristics of successful student teams, and do these match the teams that you've worked in? And what has been the outcome of those teams? So let's consider how you can improve your team contribution through improving your own self-awareness. I'd like to introduce you to the concept of transactional analysis and how knowledge of transactional analysis might be useful to helping you work more effectively in your teams. The main research around transactional analysis is the work of Dr. Eric Berne from the 1950s. It provides a framework for analysing our own and others' behaviours and works on the basic principle that increased self-awareness leads to increased performance. One of our most important skills as an effective practitioner is self-awareness and critical reflection. So being able to analyse and reflect on our own behaviours is important to enable us to identify why situations have arisen, why we get stuck in patterns of behaviour, and to be able to consciously think about how we respond to situations so that we are not relying on our emotions to drive our responses. We need to analyse and reflect on other people's behaviour to understand why they are reacting the way they are. And by understanding others and what's driving their behaviour, we can come up with a better approach for dealing with them. So ultimately, increased self-awareness leads to increased performance and enables us to act appropriately and in an informed manner. So let's look in more detail at transactional analysis. We all have 3 ego or behaviour states, and they are referred to as the parent, adult and child. And we can be in any one of these states at any one time. The parent state has 2 sides to it. The first side is the nurturing parent, and the second side is the controlling parent. As we can see from this slide, these are some of the characteristics of someone in their nurturing parent ego state. If you're in this ego state, you are generally keen to give advice. For example, if someone comes to you with a problem, you're more likely to try and advise them on how to deal with it than let them work it out for themselves. You may behave in a very protective manner, which might involve making excuses for other people as to why they were late or didn't do their work, or you may offer to do it for them if you think they are struggling to cope. In this state, you will be encouraging colleagues and teammates, building up team motivation and looking after or nurturing new team members, taking them under your wing as it were. The second parent state is that of controlling parent. This is where you are setting limits. Perhaps you're chairing a meeting and you're limiting the time each speaker has. You tend to act in a more disciplinarian manner at this stage. You might perhaps stop a conversation as being inappropriate, or you might get annoyed with people when you think they're behaving in an inappropriate manner. A controlling parent tends to judge or criticise what is happening and likes to operate within rules and regulations. Neither one of these states is better than the other out of context. The real trick is knowing the time and place when either one of these ego states is appropriate and relevant to be in. For example, if you are to adapt a nurturing parent state and do the work of one of your colleagues for them, this might be supported on the one hand and appropriate if you had finished your work and they were never going to get theirs done on time. But if they were just being lazy and making you feel sorry for them, you could find out that you now have your work plus their work to do whilst they go off and have a lovely day out and do nothing. So you need to be able to identify when each of these states is appropriate. Similarly, a controlling parent might be appropriate if you were chairing a team meeting, as you need to keep everyone on track. To be clear, controlling doesn't necessarily mean you are being aggressive, but think of it as firm but fair. However, if you are trying to brainstorm some new ideas and generate creativity, then a controlling parent might hinder the ability to do this and stop some really good ideas from forming. The second ego or behaviour state is that of the adult. The adult has only one side to it and is generally considered to be a rational, unemotional state where we are at our most analytical. We are objectively trying to understand the situation and look for answers and solutions. In this state, we tend to ask a lot of questions to gather data or information to improve our understanding. The third state we inhabit is the child state, and this has two sides to it. The first side, referred to as the natural or free child, and the second side is the adapted child. When we are in the natural or free child state, we are at our most creative. We enjoy experimenting, we like to have a bit of fun. And this can be great when you're brainstorming ideas, trying to come up with new ways of working, as sometimes we need to consider the far out and the impossible before we can find something appropriate. The free child state, however, can also be negative if we are in it at the wrong time. For example, in a presentation to the board, you don't want to be messing about or inappropriately making jokes. This state can be disruptive and damage the effectiveness of the group. The second child state is the adapted child, and this is where we exhibit behaviour that we have learnt, probably that we've been conditioned into throughout our childhood and working lives. This is where we either do what we are told or we rebel against it, as that is the behaviour we've learnt we can get away with. The key to understanding this state is that most of our behaviour is learnt and therefore it's driven by something specific, perhaps a need to please or a desire for attention. So why is it important to understand these ego states and what do they look like in practice? Well, they have implications for managing conflict and ensuring that the team progresses effectively and efficiently. It's quite possible to get stuck in a certain transaction that hinders progress. For example, let's assume that you are a nurturing parent and your team member is an adapted child. Their adapted child has learnt to depend on others to do things for them so that they don't have to do the work for themselves. Basically, you now have an adaptive child as a team member that you're trying to talk to. You're in a nurturing parent ego state and your conversation will go something like this. You as the nurturing parent will say to your colleague, "How are you getting on with that part of the group project?" The adaptive child will respond, "I'm really struggling. I don't know when I'm going to get it done. I haven't even started it yet. And I've still got another 2 modules to complete. And I've got my brother coming over this weekend. Plus I'm not really sure what it is I have to do." As a nurturing parent, your response might be, "Well, do you want to look at it together? We can go through it. I'll help you." And this is quite a positive response. The adaptive child may then say, "Yeah, that'd be really good, but I just don't know when I'll have the time." And the nurturing parent in you says, "Well, how about I look at it first, and then we can get together once I've had a chance to look at it." And the adaptive child, "Great, thank you. That would be amazing. You'd really be helping me out." So what's happened here, basically? You feel you are supporting and helping your team worker, and they are now confident that you're probably going to end up doing the work for them. So what happens in this scenario? Well, the likelihood is that the adaptive child won't turn up for your next meeting. You'll have a similar conversation where they tell you how difficult things are for them at the moment, and you'll all likely agree to do their part of the project for them. So how could it have been handled differently to stop you getting into this situation where you're doing all the work for someone else? Well, ultimately, you would need to change your ego state and get out of this pattern. So let's try it again by changing our ego states. Now that you're more conscious of ego states, let's run that scenario through. You're the nurturing parent again, and you say to your colleague, "How are you getting on with your part of the group project?" And the adaptive child says, "I'm really struggling. I don't know when I'm going to get it done. I haven't even started it yet. I've still got my other 2 modules to complete, and I've got my brother coming over this weekend. Plus I'm not really sure what it is I have to do." Your nurturing parent then says, "Well, do you want to look at it together? We can go through it. I'll help you." And again, this is still a positive response. The adaptive child says to you, "Yeah, that'd be really good, but I just don't know when I'll have the time." You now change from nurturing parent into adult because you recognise where this conversation is going. So in your adult state, which is rational and logical and looks for solutions, you will say, "Okay, so let's look at your timetable and find out when you have got a free period in between lessons." And the adaptive child says, "I don't have my timetable on me, so I don't know." And then you, now in adult state, "So who is in the same class as you? Let's check with them." And the adaptive child is struggling now, so they say, "It's okay, I found I've got a break at 11, but I really need to do my prep for the next seminar as I just haven't had time to do it, so we can't really do it then." So what they're trying to do is stay in adaptive child. They're still trying to get you to do the work for them, but by staying in adult, you're not having any of it. So you just say to them, "So when can we meet?" And what happens is they realise they cannot continue the conversation in adaptive child, and they will then turn unconsciously into adult and say, "Okay, so I'm in tomorrow at 3, perhaps we can get together then." And you say, "That sounds good, I'll see you then." So what has happened is that by asking questions rather than giving advice or criticising your colleague, which a parent state would do, the tone of the conversation takes a much more logical problem resolution approach, and eventually the adaptive child subconsciously turns into an adult, and they've stopped trying to make excuses and realise that you're trying to find a way to make this work. They therefore start responding in a more adult manner too, and it becomes a more collaborative, supportive working relationship. Had you continued as a nurturing parent, you would have ended up back to square one and doing their work for them. So this scenario could, if not handled appropriately, lead to conflict. Quite possibly one or other of you might have ended up getting annoyed with the other and feeling that they weren't pulling their weight. Conflict is going to be inevitable in teams, but some conflict can be positive, particularly where it stimulates interest. It can provide a means for problems to be heard. It can increase cohesiveness, promote change, and provide a means to work together. So it's important to recognise that conflict can exist, but it doesn't have to be destructive or aggressive. It's possible to disagree with someone whilst having a logical conversation about it, in which case you would expect that both of you were in an adult state. Conflict escalates to aggression when you move out of your adult ego state and lose your rational, objective and analytical thinking. Apparently we all experience about 5 conflicts a day, so how do we deal with them? Well, there are 2 natural reactions to conflict, the fight or flight. We should be consciously choosing our response in a professional or team environment so that we respond in the most appropriate manner. The use of the word fight doesn't necessarily mean it's an aggressive conflict, but you should think of fight that means to seek to resolve the conflict or to address it. As we have seen, effective teams will seek to resolve the conflict. However, as we will now explore, there could be occasions when flight, or to put it another way, avoidance, might be appropriate. So let's look in a bit more detail of the type of responses we might have in a conflict situation. Here we can see the different modes that people use to address conflict. The competing mode could be appropriate when quick action needs to be taken and you are holding an established position as a subject matter expert or leader in the field. You may also choose a competing mode if ethically you feel the actions being suggested are wrong and you need to stand your ground. To compete effectively, you need to be skilled in the art of argument, and we don't mean angry shouting argument, but instead the skills of constructing a logical, convincing, evidence-based argument that evidences the logic behind your point of view. You won't resolve conflict through competing though if you don't have any authority or expertise to back up and support your position. You need a logical argument with evidence. Sometimes avoiding can be seen as a negative approach, but sometimes it's worth walking away if what is being disputed is irrelevant or has no bearing on the work of the team, or perhaps it has little impact or significance. It can also be a strategy to use on something that you don't have the full information on yet and need to be more informed before you can enter into discussion on it. Therefore, avoiding can be an appropriate strategy to take. However, if avoiding a problem will leave something unresolved that needs to be resolved, then it might not be so appropriate. Accommodating approaches might be necessary at times to show that you are a reasonable person and that you are fair. This may be about accepting someone else's idea over your own, or it may be about complying with instructions that have come from someone in authority. Sometimes accommodating can be useful when you want to call in favours later. For example, if you went with someone else's idea last time, would it not be reasonable to go with your idea the next time round? So accommodating can be negative though, when you should be standing your ground. For example, if by agreeing to accommodate you are putting the company at a significant risk. Collaboration can lead to new ideas that wouldn't have previously been considered, so can have very positive outcomes. It involves much more analytical approach to the problem or issues, and involves active listening. Collaboration can, however, take a lot of time, so you need to ensure that you have the time to do it. But it's also important for gaining buy-in from all stakeholders, ensuring that the end result meets the needs of all parties. And finally, compromising might be appropriate if you cannot make any other progress, when there is equal power relations in the group and there is no overriding powerful argument for going a specific route. It's not always the best solution, because sometimes neither party gets what they actually wanted. Here are some questions that you may wish to ask to help you think about what conflict style to choose. In summary then, self-awareness and awareness of others is absolutely key to effective teamwork, and high-performing teams are able to manage and resolve conflict rather than ignoring it and letting it drag on. Let's move on now to look at the concept of virtual teams. As you will be aware, businesses are no longer confined by geographical locations or boundaries. According to Mullins, virtual teams are a collection of people who are geographically separated but still work closely together, and he identifies that the main communication methods between members will be by an electronic process. Now, taking into consideration the process of group formation, there are some significant implications with regards to how do we support that process with a virtual team. How can we enable the groups to go through the storming stage if they have very little social interaction with each other or work in different time zones? Some key questions we need to ask, as identified in the research by Gibson and Cohen, are how do people who speak different languages and are from different cultures develop effective ways of sharing knowledge when there is little opportunity to meet face to face? How can trust be built into virtual teams, and is trust necessary for performance? What should managers look for in selecting members of virtual teams, and what can leaders do to coordinate and motivate virtual teams to high performance? Gibson and Cohen identify 3 conditions which need to be established to enable virtual teams to perform well. The first is that there is a need to create a shared understanding around what the goals are and how they are going to be achieved. This is similar to supporting groups through the storming stage of Tuckman's model. The second is about integration, and here Gibson and Cohen argue that members of virtual teams can often come from different parts of the same organisation, or even different organisations. An organisation's policies, structures and systems all have an impact on employee behaviour, and if they're not compatible and have different structures and systems, it can negatively impact the formation of group norms and cohesion. Mutual trust is the third condition that needs to be enabled to support the performance of virtual teams. Factors that can impact these conditions can include the context, such as the availability of training, rewards and the selection processes for joining the team. The structure of the group, such as goals, leadership and task design. The technology that is used and its accessibility. The people themselves, in terms of their skill sets, values and beliefs, and the actual processes of communication, decision making and conflict resolution. Therefore, the formation and development of virtual teams can take a lot more consideration than just ensuring everyone has an internet connection at home. One of the most significant issues experienced by virtual team members or remote workers is a sense of isolation. They can often feel ignored or demotivated. Therefore, more regular communication is needed within virtual teams than face-to-face. In summary, we have looked at the nature of groups and teams and identified that membership of teams is based on specific selection criteria and that teams are often smaller than groups. A high-performing team, according to Belbin, contains a balance of 9 key roles, although does not necessarily require 9 individuals to fulfill them. Group norms and cohesion have a significant impact on the effectiveness of the team, and effective team members demonstrate 6 key areas of skill, but most importantly, high-performing teams have a shared sense of commitment and responsibility.